So we're continuing our consideration of the neo-patristic school. We've seen the origins, the nature of what it's all about, particularly in terms of the thinking of Father George Florovsky and his reflections and his notions of what he referred to as the neo-patristic synthesis should be. We also saw very briefly some of the major achievements. I just sort of mentioned them as titles because a number of them will come back in the case studies in the last three classes. What I'd like to conclude with in terms of our consideration of the neo-patristic theology are really the downsides. Some of the critiques that have been offered over the years of different aspects of this particular approach to theology. The most explicit critiques of the neo-patristic approach, as advocated in particular by George Florovsky, were initially directed against his book, The Ways of Orthodox Theology. What we have in the reader is the breaks and links, the conclusion to that book. When the book came out in 1937 in Paris, it created what I describe as a kind of a firestorm in the Russian Orthodox community because of its really unrelenting critique of almost all aspects of Russian theology up to World War I. The sort of written expression of this reaction is primarily in the form of a book review of the book by Nicholas Berdyaev. Berdyaev wrote a fairly extensive review published in the journal that he was editing himself, that Berdyaev edited, a journal called Put, P-U-T in Russian, which means the way. And this is the text that we have under the title Orthodoxia and Humanness in our reader beginning on page 182. So I will be quoting from that as we go through these critiques. Even though Florovsky was, Berdyaev was really critiquing Florovsky's book, as it turns out, many of the points that he raises are valid criticisms of the neo-patristic approach as a whole. So it was kind of a prophetic sort of review of the book. After Berdyaev fired his first shot against the book, but also in effect against Florovsky's project as a whole, criticism of the neo-patristic approach to theology was actually quite muted and usually indirect, in some cases in the form of other histories of Russian thought, which acted as kind of correctives to Florovsky's critique. The perspective was a little bit different, but there are three books that I want to mention in particular that, as I said, act as kind of antidotes or offsets to Florovsky.
Sorry, you mentioned that, you said that Florovsky's thoughts were correct or the opposite? At the beginning, I missed that piece. You said eventually it was like his thoughts or his writings or his criticisms were...
well, no, Berdyaev's
okay.
critique of Florovsky,
okay,
as it turned out, was a prophetic because, I mean, he was writing in 1937, just when Florovsky's book came out, but the neo-patristic mode of theology was really the dominant mode of theology for the rest of the 20th century, and even now is kind of a normative mode of theology. But with the passage of time, weaknesses in this approach to theology became increasingly evident. But already in 1937, when Berdyaev wrote his review, some of the points that he criticized in Florovsky's book have turned out to be critiques of the neo-patristic theology as a whole, and we'll see this. We'll spend most of the class on this. The three books that I want to mention that I said act as kind of correctives to Florovsky. Two of them came out almost at the same time in the late 1940s and early 1950s. All three books are mentioned in the general bibliography, so if you have that, it's on page 15 of the syllabus. The two that came out virtually simultaneously, and they have the same titles, ironically. Histories of Russian Philosophy. One is by Nicholas Lovsky. A History of Russian Philosophy is the English translation. Both, of course, were written in Russian, and they were both translated quite early on into English and French. Sorry, Karim, did you have a question? Yes?
Yeah, sorry, what do you mean by correctives to that?
Well, they present a different perspective. You see, I mean, Florovsky's book is an interpretation of the actual, what we might call the intellectual history, or the history of theology and philosophy. But I think we have to put the two of them together. You really can't distinguish very clearly, neatly, particularly in Russian thought, between history and philosophy. So he presented one interpretation. His interpretation was based almost entirely on the criterion of whether or not a particular thinker or writer was influenced by aspects of Western thinking. That was his major criterion in the book. Others, Nicholas Lovsky, Basil Zenkovsky, and Paul Evdokimov, present their own interpretations of Russian thinking without using that particular criterion as being the major basis on which to judge Russian thinking. So they come up with quite different results. See, this is the difference between, you know, a primary material and secondary material. The primary material in this case would be the thinking and publications over the years, particularly in the 19th century and early 20th century, of the various Russian philosophers, theologians, what have you. That would be the primary material. Secondary material is how somebody describes and presents this and interprets it and assesses it. So that's secondary. So you can get quite different readings of the same material depending on the observer's point of view. So I said Florovsky is representing one point of view with a criterion that he was using to assess pretty well everybody. These others are using, I would say, other criteria that are perhaps not as clear as Florovsky's criterion, but they try to be a little bit more neutral in trying to assess each thinker on his or her own merits. I mean, all are writing from an Orthodox perspective. These are all committed Orthodox personalities, so they're not writing from, you know, a strict, neutral, non-religious kind of perspective. So Nicholas Lovsky, his History of Russian Philosophy. Nicholas Lovsky is the father of Vladimir Lovsky. He was a philosopher in his own right, and it.
Sorry, would Vladimir Lovsky be considered a neo-patristic?
Yes, very much so.
Okay.
Very much so.
So his father had a different.
His father was more in the religious Renaissance or religious philosophy mode, and said he was sort of more. If you consider philosophy and theology as a kind of a continuum rather than here and there, he was more on the philosophical side, his son, Vladimir, was definitely more on the theological side, but was also very much in the neo-patristic mode. What is quite interesting is when Nicholas Lavsky writes about his own son, he handles it very delicately, to say the least. So Nicholas Lavsky's History of Russian Philosophy, and about the same time, Basil Zenkovsky wrote a History of Russian Philosophy. I said both were translated very early into English, and so were sort of easily available. In fact, they were translated before Vladimir Lavsky's Mystical Theology was translated into English. Though what these do, they present almost but not quite the same material as Florovsky, because they do emphasize more the philosophical side, but they come up with quite different results. I said much more balanced in their assessments, and without sort of emphasizing the sort of constant ranting about, which Florovsky tended to do, about Western influences in Russian thought. Of the two, just sort of a footnote, of the two books, Nicholas Lavsky's History of Russian Philosophy is more well known. It's also available online in a PDF. But personally, I think that Basil Zenkovsky's is more it's more perceptive, it's more detailed, and I think more profound than Nicholas Lavsky's book.
Is it in the syllabus, the second book?
Yes. Yes, it is. It's the second last one on page 16, History of Russian Philosophy, the English translation in 1953. The last one that I would put in this category is a relatively small book by Paul Evdokimov, who is also one of the leading neo-patristic scholars. The French title is Le Christ dans la pensée russe. Literal translation would be Christ in Russian Thought. It came out in 1970, so it's kind of like 20 years after the other two. Despite the title, Christ in Russian Thought, which would seem to limit the subject matter, he covers more or less the same subject matter as the other two, but emphasis very much on the 19th and 20th centuries. Unfortunately, this book has never been translated into English, and I think for that reason it is underestimated. I think it's a very good book. It's very balanced, perhaps not as profound as Zenkovsky in particular, but he does give, I think, very fair and balanced assessments of a very wide range of Russian thinkers. So these three books kind of act as correctives to Florovsky, in effect saying, well, there's not only the sole criterion for assessing an Orthodox thinker should not be whether or not they have been subject to Western influence, but how much they reflect a broader tradition and a seeking of truth as sort of a wider criterion. As an example of a different perspective of really the same person and in fact the same book, we have in the readers, we have assessments of probably one of the more controversial figures of the Russian religious Renaissance, Father Pavel Florensky. This is starting on page 138 in the book, section 18. I put it, the title I put is Pavel Florensky, Pro and Con. And there are two texts there, one by Florovsky, Religious Philosophy in the Pre-War Decade, which is primarily on Sergius Bulgakov and Pavel Ferensky, and it is an extract from The Ways of Russian Theology, his 1937 book. And the other is an extract from Lofsky's book that I just mentioned, Nicholas Lofsky's book, his History of Russian Philosophy, where he talks about Ferensky. So let's have a look at these. I won't go into this in too much detail, but just sort of point out to you, how it's possible to have very different perceptions of the same person and the same writings, and come out with quite different conclusions. And see, this is the question of whether we're looking at primary material or secondary material. And in secondary material, the question is, what is the perspective or the sort of built-in presuppositions that the writer is using to assess his material? I mean, in effect, your essays are secondary material. You are looking at primary material and putting it together in a coherent fashion, and then giving some kind of assessment of that material. So this is sort of a standard academic way to proceed, is this kind of approach. So on page 138, so we won't go through the details of the whole thing, but if you look on, it starts on page 138, but the part on Ferensky starts on page 141 on the right-hand side. Sorry, the left-hand side, the little bottom paragraph. The most characteristic monument of the pre-war period remains Father Pavel Ferensky's famous book, The Pillar, and should be The Pillar and Ground of Truth, is the standard translation of the Russian title of that book, 1914. It said pre-war. Well, it was just published months before the war broke out. This book demonstrates in the clearest possible way every ambiguity and failing in the Russian religious philosophical movement. Swarovski is very critical of Russian religious philosophy, partly because it was so heavily influenced by Western thought, and more particularly by German philosophy. So this section of Swarovski's book, which goes on for the next 3 or 4 pages, well, virtually up to the end of the chapter on page 143, is actually based on a review that Swarovski had written of the book. The part that I want to read, and when you read this, you see that he is criticizing not only Ferensky's ideas. Sometimes you have to be very careful because I confuse them sometimes when I'm speaking. Swarovski and Ferensky. Swarovski is criticizing not only Ferensky's ideas, but in some cases he criticizes him as a person. And unfortunately, the Russians often do this. It's hard for them to distinguish the two in their writings, and we have a prime example of it here. I mean, he criticizes Ferensky personally.
Mm-hmm.
And I have a lot of difficulty
I was just
with
that. Had no sense for history.
Yes, yes.
Just one
but it's the sentences above that, Hilda, that I want to point to in particular. Ferensky, this is on page, so we're on page 141, on the right-hand side, the last couple of sentences in the first block paragraph there. Ferensky always lived in a secluded, cozy nook, and such aesthetic solitude is where he wished to live. Notice it's aesthetic and not aesthetic. So aesthetic is search for beauty. Mm-hmm.
So he's more materialistic versus...
Pardon?
So he's trying to say that he's more materialistic than he is...
In effect, I mean, he's criticizing him as being sort of isolated in the secluded, cozy nook, and such aesthetic sites where it's where he lived to live. He always escaped from the tragic crossroads of life and concealed himself in a confined but comfortable cell. I said this is a critique of the person here. It's not of his ideas, but so he's trying to run him down, not only his ideas but also his life. And here I have to come to the Florovsky's rescue in part. Florovsky was writing this book in the mid-1930s, and the book was published in 1937. At that time, Florensky's fate was not known. I mentioned earlier that Florensky was the only one of the leading Russian theologians, philosopher-theologians, who remained in Russia after the Russian Revolution. And he voluntarily remained in Russia. He could have escaped. He could have gone into exile, but he didn't. He chose to stay. Eventually, he was arrested and sent into exile the first time, and then he was released, and he was arrested a second time, and he was sent to the camps. More specifically, in the mid-1930s, to a camp called Solovsky, which was on an island in the White Sea in northern Russia. It was a monastery. It was one of the leading Russian monasteries, and the Bolsheviks turned it into a concentration camp, in effect, for, ironically, many of the religious leaders of Russia. Now, I said what was not known at the time was what happened to Florensky. He just sort of vanished from the scene. It was subsequently became known, well, initially around 1942-43, the predecessor of the KGB, the NKVD, circulated a rumor in the West, this is during the war, that Florensky had died, without sort of too much explanation of how or when he died. And it was only actually in the early 1990s, after the fall of communism, when the KGB archives were opened, that somebody went to the archives and found Florensky's file. And it was quite clear in the file that Florensky had actually been executed in 1937. He had been shot in the firing squad. But this had not been known. So Florovsky did not, of course, know what had happened to Florensky. Florensky, in a sense, was an easy target because he wasn't around in Western Europe to defend himself or to explain his ideas. I think that perhaps if Florovsky had known of Florensky's fate, in effect, Florensky is a martyr. Perhaps he would not have written this kind of language about him. When he talks about a secluded, cozy nook and a confined cell, well, yeah, it was a cell, all right, but it was a cell in a concentration camp. I don't think it was very comfortable. And ironically, it was not, you know, he says Florensky, escaped from the tragic crossroads of life. Well, in fact, it was Florovsky who escaped from the tragic crossroads of life by going into exile. It was Florensky who stayed at the crossroads and suffered for it. So this kind of language and assessment, you really have to sort of understand it in a broader historical context and not simply take it as face value. So I won't go through all of the critiques that he makes of Florensky's thinking. I find it very offensive that Florovsky should be so outspoken in criticizing Florensky as a person. But just to contrast that, we'll read one other paragraph here, where I think Florovsky does have a good point on the basis of critiquing Florensky's thinking or his ideas. And this is on page 142. On the bottom of the left-hand side, Do you have that? The reason is saved from doubt?
Sure. Reason is saved from doubt through a consciousness of the Holy Trinity, about which Florensky speaks with great ardor. He presents the speculative meaning of the dogma of the Trinity as the truth of reason. However, he somehow bypasses the incarnation and proceeds immediately from a discussion of the Trinity to the doctrine of the Spirit, the Comforter. His book simply contains no discussion of Christology. The experiment in Orthodox theodicy is somehow carried out without Christ. The image of Christ, the image of the God-man, becomes a vague shadow lost in the background. Is this not the reason why Florensky's book contains so little joy? Its beauty is merely autumnal, dying, weary beauty. He does not rejoice in the coming of the Lord. He is overcome with expectation of the Comforter and with hope for the Spirit. Instead of rejoicing in the Comforter who has already come, he languishes and thirsts for a greater one. Similarly, he does not sense the ever-present abiding of the Spirit who has descended into the world. The Church's vision of the Spirit seems vague and dim to him. He detects the revelation of the Spirit only in a few chosen people, and not in the everyday life of the Church. It is as if salvation had not occurred.
Okay, I think we can stop there. You sort of get the picture of what he's criticizing. I mean, apart from the excesses of language, you'll be told if you use that kind of language in your essays that it's not appropriate. His basic point that Florensky's great book, the Pillar and Ground of Truth, does not have a discussion of the Incarnation and Christology. There's no chapter on Christology. He's quite right. His essential critique is correct. Mm-hmm. It's almost inconceivable. How can you write a book of Christian theology without devoting a considerable chapter and sort of space to the Incarnation and Christ? So from that point of view, he's right. I mean, he overstates his case in some of the language that he uses. Now there is a kind of a footnote to this. This critique of Florensky, in particular, actually affected in a substantial way Father Sergius Bulgakov when he was writing his great theological works. So Bulgakov offers a corrective to Florensky by devoting an entire book to Christ, to Christology, the Incarnation. It's called The Lamb of God. It came out in 1933 in its original edition. So Bulgakov realized that yes, there is something wrong, and Florensky is right in this critique, so that he tries to offset this by a whole substantial book, probably one of his 2 or 3 most important ones, to Christology. So that's sort of one reading of Florensky. If we look at now, I have here Evdokimov, but it's not Evdokimov, it's Lofsky. Lofsky's reading of Florensky, which starts on page 144. See, this is from Lofsky's History of Russian Philosophy, first published in English translation in 1951. He has a whole chapter on Florensky. Very different image emerges from this presentation of Florensky. Much more positive in his assessment. He gives some background to Florensky's life, and then goes on to cite some personal experiences of people who met Florensky. But look at the kind of language that he uses when talking about Florensky's work. For example, on page 145, at the top of the right-hand side, the book, the Pillar and Foundation of Truth, is remarkable for its subject, its form, its outer appearance. The author displays in it an almost superhuman erudition, knowledge. He is thoroughly at home in the domain of philosophy, theology, philology, and mathematics. He also supports his philosophizing by arguments borrowed from medicine, psychopathology, folklore, and particularly linguistics. He likes to compare the deviation in the different languages of such terms as truth, faith, heart, etc. It's a very much more positive assessment of the same work. And again, sort of another sort of positive assessment where he talks about Florensky's use of the notion of consubstantiality in order to make clear, as he said here, the nature of love. This is on page 146 at the top. Inquiring into, on the right-hand side, inquiring into the relation between creative personalities, Father Pavel Florensky makes the use of the idea of consubstantiality in order to make clear the nature of love. And so he talks about this notion of consubstantiality, which was first used in patristic thinking with respect to the Trinity. This is the famous expression homoousios that occurs in the Nicene Creed. The Son is consubstantial with the Father. So he uses that notion, extending it to human existence.
So where was that part?
This is 146 at the top.
146?
Yes.
Okay.
At the top of the right-hand side, inquiring into the relation between created personalities or created persons. It's one of the problems of translation. Father Pavel makes use of the idea of consubstantiality in order to make clear the nature of love. The part that I want to read on this is down at the bottom there, sort of 2 paragraphs further down. Not only friendship between two individuals, but all true love is impossible without the participation of the divine power. And he quotes, "In loving, we love in and through God, since love necessarily demands that we should overcome the limits of selfhood and enter into a new realm of being, which bears throughout the stamp of beauty. Indeed, true love creates a reality in which 3 absolute values are recognized. In love, God enters into the lover's self, and there is knowledge of God as absolute truth, which is love. In relation to the other, to thou, that love is goodness. As objectively contemplated by a third, the love for another is beauty. Truth, goodness, beauty. This metaphysical triad is not 3 different principles, but one. It is one and the same spiritual life considered from different points of view." I mean, he's quoting here from Florensky, but in a very positive sense, that this is, in effect, when somebody has this kind of quotation, unless the person critiques the quotation, it means he's using it in support of his own argument. But just sort of on a little aside, when what Florensky is using here is the Platonic triad, truth, goodness, beauty, and tying it to love, tying it to a 4th principle. So let's see if there's something else here. See, the whole analysis here is as I said, very positive. Let's look at page 150 on the left-hand side. What valuable additions. Mikhail, do you have that? Can you read that paragraph?
What valuable additions has Father Pavel Florensky made to a Christian world conception? His chief merit is that he deliberately made use of the idea of consubstantiality, not only Trinitarian theology, but in metaphysics, namely in his doctrine of the structure of the created personalities. He divides all philosophical systems into two classes according to whether they recognize consubstantiality or merely similarly. A homoousion, a philosophy which recognizes merely genetic likeness and not numeral identity is rationalistic. It is the philosophy of concepts and of the understanding of things and life's immortality. The homoousian philosophy, which recognizes the consubstantiality, is the philosophy of the ideas and the reasons philosophy of the personality and the creative achievement.
Oh, this requires a little bit of interpretation. The two Greek words there, they look the same, but if you look at them closely, you'll see that the first one is homoiousian, with an I between the two O's, and the other one is homoousian. Now, the normal translation of these terms, the first one would be similar, and the second one would be identical. So the homoousian, or homoousios, is the foundation of the doctrine of the Trinity, where the three persons of the Trinity are consubstantial. In other words, having the same essence, of the same essence. That's what it means, homoousian, of the same essence. The argument in the 4th century with the Arians was the Arians were supporting the homoiousian of a similar.
So they divided the essence.
Yes.
Right? Also.
Well, they of a similar nature, but not identical.
So
they created a hierarchy whereby the Son and the Spirit are created and not of the same essence or nature as the Father. So Sadlowski's analysis here is really quite profound. I mean, he has extracted this from Florensky and arguing that this is a significant theological and philosophical contribution, as he said, to a Christian world conception. And it's actually very closely tied to the theology of the human person. That's where it comes into play. So just to sort of conclude this a little bit of an aside here, what you have in somebody like Nicholas Sadlowski is quite a positive assessment of Florensky in a very stark contrast with what Florowski has written. Sadlowski does take up in the last paragraph, he mentions Florowski's critique. Stern critical, this is on page 151 in the last paragraph on the right-hand side. Stern critical remarks and evaluations contained in Father Florowski's remarkable book, this is Florowski's The Ways of Russian Theology, usually contain at least a fraction of the truth. But in defense of Father Pavel Florensky, the following considerations should be taken into account: the diseases of modern civilization, the loss of the idea of the absolute value of the personality. And here, you should read, the loss of the idea of the absolute value of the person, of the idea of the state based on justice, of the ideal of free spiritual creativeness, are due in the first instance to the fact that the intellectuals, and following them the masses, have forsaken Christianity, becoming non-religious. Here, Sadlowski is very much reflecting the Russian experience in terms of sort of what happened in the late imperial period and subsequently when he's talking about the intellectuals forsook Christianity and became non-religious and were followed by the masses in the support of a good part of the Russian population for the Russian Revolution. I mean, the Russian Revolution was not just the work of a half a dozen intellectuals sitting around in a debating society. They had a lot of support, obviously, to carry out what they did. The main task of our epoch is to bring first the intellectuals and through them the masses back to Christianity and subsequently to Christian humanism. That purpose may be particularly well served by religiously philosophical works written in the newer, more or less secular style, connecting religious problems with modern science and metaphysical investigations of the higher realms of being which transcend the human world. Florensky's works belong to this category and therefore are highly valuable, whatever defects they may have from the point of view of the traditional style and content of Orthodox theological literature. He said earlier in this, he does recognize some of the valid critiques of Florensky, particularly the Christology or the lack of Christology. But he says you have to sort of look at this in a broader context. So I said this is the kind of corrective that was brought as a partial critique of Florovsky's approach to creating a new theological project. So let's look at now at specific critiques that have been raised, partly by Berdyaev in his review of the ways of Russian theology, and subsequently by other writers over the decades since Florovsky first advocated his project publicly in 1936. The first of these critiques I would put under the label of Byzantinism. And I've hinted at this a little bit in the last class, pointing out in Florovsky's various writings his emphasis on the importance and status of Greek Byzantine thought as being normative, that is, as being determinative in Christianity, and particularly in Orthodoxy. Berdyaev was really the first one to point to this problem already in his review in 1937 of Florovsky's book. This is on page 186. So the review starts on page 182. If you've read this, it's very rambling, to say the least, and in some cases, in some parts, very emotional. He really gets carried away with himself. This is fairly characteristic of Berdyaev. He may be a philosopher, but he still can be very emotional in his writing. And in some cases, he really does get carried away with his critiques and the kind of language he's using. So this critique of Byzantinism, which comes under different headings, Berdyaev speaks of Hellenism. This is the sort of shorthand that he's using for this emphasis on Greek Byzantine thought. So the first one on page 186, I'll read this little one. It's down at the bottom, just a couple of sentences there.
Page
186 on the left-hand side. The second last line, in his Hellenism. I said he's using Hellenism here as a shorthand for Greek Byzantine thought. Father George Florovsky wants evidently to make absolute the categories of Greek thought, to acknowledge them as eternal. In this he has a resemblance to Thomism, which acknowledges the universality of Greek intellectualism. He's taking a little stab at Florovsky, in effect, by accusing him of following a Thomistic or Western scholastic model in his approach. a little bit further down, where is he? Where does that come up? In the next paragraph there, the paragraph that starts, Florovsky denounced modernism, about 2/3 of the way down the paragraph. The patristics, that's kind of a funny expression. The English translation of this, I have to say, of this text is a little bit weak. The patristics really doesn't make any sense. It really should be patristic theology or patristic thought. We're steeped in philosophic elements taken from Greek philosophy, and herein also is the question whether the Greek intellectualism of the patristics, in other words, of the fathers, the early fathers of the church, be eternal and immutable. This Greek intellectualism issues from man, not from God. George Florovsky does the same as the scholastics did, again accusing him of using the same methodology as scholastic theology. But with him it is altogether without foundation and not worked out. The Orthodox East did not have its own St. Thomas Aquinas. So this question of the importance that Florovsky gives to Greek Byzantine thought over other traditions within Christianity, the Latin tradition, the Oriental Orthodox traditions, he's questioning whether it's correct to make this as he says, eternal, immutable, to acknowledge them as eternal and in effect normative, that is determinative. Carry on.
Is that part of the new patristic system, I guess, that Florovsky introduced? Has that persisted till now? Like, for example, in contemporary.
Pretty much so. And we'll see this particularly when we looked at the case studies, where it works out in terms of specific examples. Mm-hmm. I mean, Florovsky's basic message was, let's go back and use the fathers as a starting point for our theology. But as I said, he was constantly aware of the problem of simply repeating the fathers, and that's why I emphasized in the last class that Florovsky emphasized the return to the fathers not as simply a bunch of quotations from the fathers, but as a way of doing theology. Mm-hmm. And that's a more difficult message.
The mindset.
Yes,
yeah.
Yes, because there has been a tendency in at least some of the Orthodox theologians of the second half of the 20th century to focus on simply quoting the fathers, in mm-hmm. effect, to prove a theological point or settle a theological dispute, rather than using a methodology in order to arrive at a conclusion. This weakness that Bergey first identified in kind of funny language, but not quite. I mean, he puts his finger right on the mm-hmm. point that Florovsky was trying to eternalize patristic thought. Just to quote a few others who have made the same critique of not only Florovsky but of neo-patristic theology. One is Father John Meyendorff. Now, John Meyendorff is himself a great Byzantinist. He was primarily a Byzantine historian of Byzantine thought, a major figure in the neo-patristic school. He wrote an introduction to a reprint in 1983 of the Russian edition of Florovsky's The Ways of Russian Theology. Meyendorff makes the same point as Bergyayev in 1937. So this is what Meyendorff writes in this introduction. Without denying the intelligence, the talent, or the abilities of certain writers, and always sketching a lively portrait of each epoch, Father George applies to each and to all the patristic or Byzantine criterion, which he has definitely adopted and which is for him the only one which is orthodox. An orthodox theologian certainly has the right to ask himself if Florovsky does not consider the tradition of the Fathers too narrowly. If we wish to criticize Russian Orthodoxy in the name of Byzantinism, would it not also be appropriate to critique Byzantinism itself? Is it Byzantinism, or a Greek Byzantine thought, is it equivalent to holy tradition as such? He puts it in the form of a question.
I found interesting, just the last paragraph in 186, where he's saying, Father George Florovsky esteems not even Hellenism, but rather Byzantinism, which philosophically was already on the decline. Like I found, like, this is interesting. What they're looking at it at is, his objectivism is altogether groundless. Simple, like the whole paragraph there, just so. I guess they sense at that time there was almost two ways of looking
Yes.
at how we're going to go. Some people thought that Byzantium was in decline and we need to, and then some continued with the same tradition. Am I reading this
well,
right?
I mean, see, in some parts of this text, Berdyaev is using Hellenism, as I said, as a shorthand for Greek Byzantine thought. When he's making the distinction here, I think his distinction would be between Hellenism in a much broader sense, because Hellenism also includes, for example, pre-Christian Greek civilization and culture,
Philosophy,
including philosophy. So he's sort of saying that, you know, let's look, Hellenism is much broader than just the reflection of it in Christian terms. Okay. So that might be one approach to it, which can be certainly contested from a Christian point of view, because in looking at Greek philosophy, the early fathers of the church sort of took what was useful and discarded the rest.
Right.
So let's. So it said Meyendorff himself, in the quotation that I read, then is critiquing the book that he's introducing. He's critiquing Florovsky on those grounds, but he's not the only one. There are others. For example, then Bishop and now Metropolitan Hilarion Alfayev. Does his name ring a bell? Anybody? Hilarion Alfayev. He's currently probably number 2 in the Russian Orthodox Church. His current title is Metropolitan Hilarion Alfayev. He's a theologian in his own right, but he's currently the head of the External Relations Department of the Moscow Patriarchate. He's written a lot of material on theology. In one of his essays, he quotes both Berdyaev and Meyendorff, the passage that I've just read, and he states quite flatly, quote, "One cannot, for instance, judge Syriac, Latin, or Russian patristics from a Byzantine perspective," which in effect is what Florovsky is trying to do. Alfayev recognizes the legitimacy of non-Byzantine theological traditions. Quote, "Holy tradition is not equivalent to Byzantinism, since besides the Byzantine tradition, it includes Latin, Russian, and many other avenues of thinking as well." It's legitimate to question whether this charge of Byzantinism, directed against Florovsky in particular, can be applied to the neo-patristic school as a whole. I think it's a legitimate accusation, that it has to be nuanced when we come to other individual theologians in the neo-patristic mode of theology. There are a couple of sort of general remarks that I think are pertinent. The first is that by and large, neo-patristic theologians are certainly more familiar with the Greek fathers than with Latin or Oriental fathers. I mean, yes, the works of the Latin fathers are widely available in the originals, easily available in both originals and translation, although very few Orthodox theologians are familiar enough with Latin to be able to read the original text in Latin, but there are good translations available. It's not the case with the Oriental fathers. Their texts are hard to get, and a lot of material has not been translated. So that's a more problematic one. So from that sense, it was easier for Orthodox scholars after Florovsky to access the Greek sources rather than Latin or Oriental sources. But I think a second consideration, sort of more difficult to pin down in a way, is that neo-patristic scholars are simply more at ease with the thinking of the Greek fathers and can more easily sort of incorporate them into their own writings than Latin or Oriental fathers.
So someone such as Father John Meindorf, who's a part of the neo-patristic school of thought, but criticizes holding Byzantine tradition as, the tradition of the church. What does he view their like the father's methodology or mind to be?
He doesn't really elaborate very much. I mean, most of John Meindorf's writings are really what we might put under the category of history of theology, or sort of intellectual history of the Byzantine Empire. I mean, that's really his specialty. He doesn't elaborate as a methodology as such, but he is questioning, in a sense, perhaps even his own approach to theology in that remark about, is Byzantinism the only way to assess all forms of Christian theology? Is that the only criterion? A second critique, a little bit more subtle, would be under the heading of traditionalism or historicism. We will go into this a little bit more detail when we have one of our case studies on tradition and distinctions between dogma and doctrine and theologomena. Berdyaev accuses Florovsky of having yielded, quote, to the temptation of historicism, that is, making history again into an absolute criterion, particularly the history of Greek Byzantine thought.
Would that equate to the Antiochian style of exegesis in terms of understanding the Bible and an explanation?
Would that be, sorry?
Equate it or make it similar to the way the Antiochian style of exegesis?
It would be closer, yes, to the Antiochian as distinct from the Alexandrian approach, sort of sticking to a more literal approach. The danger here, in one of his essays, Florovsky quotes a statement of a historian called Mark Bloch, B-L-O-C-H. Christianity is a religion of historians, which requires a little bit, actually quite a bit of explanation. Is Christianity simply history? Well, somehow that doesn't include everything. History, yes, is important, especially sort of 2,000 years after Christ and after the whole history of salvation as recorded in the books of the Old Testament. But surely there's more to Christianity than just history. The danger here is to consider tradition and Orthodox, whether Byzantine, Eastern Orthodox or Oriental Orthodox, attach a great deal of importance to tradition. The danger is to turn tradition into traditionalism, to make it into an ideology, and absolutize everything that comes from the past as though it all had the same value. That's the real risk. And this critique, as I said, is sort of sees that tendency in the constant emphasis in the neo-patristic approach to theology and to tradition is of sort of overstating the case and turning what should be a living and dynamic approach to tradition into a kind of a museum approach where everything is on display and is immutable because it comes from the past. And this is traditionalism. It turns it into an ideology rather than something living.
Just have a question. We are discussing neo-patristic theology and the critiques, right? When Alfeev is just talking about that, he says that we have to take into consideration like the Orientals and the Latin fathers. Original theology was a patristic theology, it was a Byzantine theology, and was a neo-patristic theology. Obviously, should take like the basis as like the Byzantine theology. What Alfeev now, like he's just criticizing, he's like coming up with the idea of universalism, universal understanding of some sort of particular issues, like modern issues, right? But we also have to understand that like neo-patristic theology, like mind and whatever we have just discussed, to apply this patristic theology to some modern and contemporary issues is becoming very difficult. I think it's a very dynamic, it's a not only just the Byzantine theology, we can obviously, could be like a one part, but it should, this world is moving, it's a dynamic it's dynamic movement, right? You just cannot take like only one. What fathers actually commented and said in the past, it's there, but there are new, there's archaeology, there's like new science and all the other contemporary issues. They're talking about, criticizing. It's more kind of like, to me, it seems to me that it's more like a theoretical understanding. On a practical view, when it comes down to like a practical resolution, like to particular like issues, no one's actually, I don't know, we haven't seen, maybe we will see like what is, like how do they actually say, how do they apply this take this Byzantine or this, or even Oriental thinking and apply to, has anyone done anything like that? Even Alfeev, like when he's talking about like this, like taking into consideration the ideas of the Latin and Orientals and this universal, has he ever done anything like to apply to a particular subject?
Well, as we will see when it comes down to particular themes and problems, again, probably in terms of contemporary critiques of the neo-patristic approach to theology, is that in practice it has had a lot of difficulty in dealing with modern issues because of this sort of constant emphasis on patristic thinking, and narrowly defined in terms of Greek Byzantine thought. The issues that the fathers were facing in the 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries are quite different from the issues that we're facing in the 20th and 21st centuries. But we'll come to that. So that's a major contemporary critique of the way that neo-patristic theology has been practiced. On this question of say, traditionalism and a tendency to, in effect, overstate the writings of the fathers. Others have commented on this. Berdyaev sort of identifies this as a problem, but if we look at even as far back as Bulgakov's essay on tradition, Dogmatic and Dogmatic Theology is the title of the essay, also published in 1937. he was quite aware of the problem. Now, of course, he didn't have Florovsky's book in hand, but he's quite aware of Florovsky's thinking, because they were both teaching at the St. Sergius Institute in Paris. This is on page 119, -7. No, he said the 119-7. Yeah, these are texts that I hadn't in the first edition put in, so I've sort of kept the order of the pages the same and simply renumbered the page. So it's 119-7. This is the Bulgakov's essay called Dogma and Dogmatic Theology, first published in a collection of writings under the title Living Tradition in 1937. And this is the paragraph that starts 3a. On the right-hand side, the second full paragraph, such an approach, where he's talking about relying exclusively on the writings of the early fathers. Do you have that? Such an approach could be consigned?
Yeah. Such an approach could be consigned to quaint historic rarity, if it were not sometimes evident even today as a leading force in theology. Yet Orthodox theology is not the Talmud and real veneration of the fathers, must reverence not the letter but the spirit. The writings of the Holy Fathers must have a guideline authority.
Guiding authority,
yet be applied with discernment. Therefore, firstly, for all of their authoritative character, the writings of the Holy Fathers need to be treated as a criterion of historical relativity, one that has unavoidable limitations. Who, in his right mind, would take as the teaching of the Church St. John of Damascus on the zodiac, although it is included in his exact exposition of the Orthodox faith, or his Dialectica, where he simply repeats the teaching of Aristotle? This limitation of the Fathers' writings is more greatly felt, of course, when it comes to their spiritual exegesis, which was
scriptural.
Scriptural exegesis, which was utterly bereft of
utterly bereft or devoid bereft
of the modern hermeneutics of textual and historical scholarship. In this area of the Fathers' writings often appear to us simply antiquated, although they retain authoritative meaning in the dogmatic and pedagogical study of the Word of God.
Yeah, just read a couple of sentences from the next paragraph.
The writings of the Holy Fathers and their dogmatic proclamations must also be understood within their historical context. One must not apply to them a meaning that is not inherent in the nature of the problems they were actually concerned with. One cannot seek in the writings of one period answers to the questions inherent in another. In any case, the writings do not possess a universality applicable to all periods in history. The writings of the Fathers are historically conditioned and therefore limited in their meaning. This does not prevent them from having an eternal value insofar as they are woven into the dogmatic conscience of the Church. But it is important to establish that the writings of the Fathers are not the Word of God and cannot be compared to it or made equal to it. In principle, nobody is making such an equation nowadays as was done before, but in fact it does happen, and this approach is harmful when put to ill use. We say this not to diminish the authority of the Fathers of the Church, but so that this authority may be taken for what it is. In fact, one of the dangers of theologizing according to the Fathers is tendency towards patristic exegesis in support of one's own particular doctrine, proof texting from statements put forward, sometimes tendentiously in the patristic texts.
Okay, we'll stop there. So you see the sort of line of critique. He's sort of raising not necessarily red flags, but at least orange flags, saying we have to be very careful when we use patristic material. This is not scripture, and we have to see it in the first instance in a historical context of their own times. What they are saying about a problem in the 4th century may not be applicable in the 20th century. I said it's a sort of a critique of this kind of traditionalism to absolutize as though it were scripture, the writings of the fathers. One of the arguments that one hears today, and you see it all over the internet, the blogosphere, you know, the fathers of the church are saints of the church. Yes, that's very true. And therefore, what they write, we have to take as being virtually inspired, etc., etc., that it has an absolute value. This is a reflection of what Bulgakov, and he's not the only one, many others have made the same point, is criticizing. My reply to this is that the church canonizes the person of the fathers, but not the writings. The writings cannot be equated with scripture. Scripture is something else. So it's legitimate to critique and to relativize, and he uses the word relative several times in there. In other words, to sort of consider it in its own context, but not necessarily as having universal and eternal value for our problems today. Sorry, Karen, you had a question.
I don't know if I'm misreading this, or maybe I'm misreading Vorowski's writings. But it seems like they're saying effectively the same thing. Like one is saying we shouldn't just quote them, we need their methodology. The other is saying no, we can't just take it in an absolute sense. And even in the sense of like where he says, well, we need to read it in a historical context. It seems to me that that's what Vorowski's saying in the sense of like, oh, we need to have a Hellenistic mind. It seems like that it's almost.
This is the, in a sense, you're quite right. In a sense, Bulgakov appears to be criticizing a straw man that he's making of Vorowski. But unfortunately, I think this is the way Vorowski has largely been interpreted, to dogmatize the writings of the fathers. Even though he himself, as we saw in the last class, he himself wrote and spoke time and time against this tendency simply to quote the fathers to resolve all theological issues. It's much more difficult to see Vorowski as advocating a method than simply proof texts. And then, as now, much of his thinking was interpreted in that way. So I had that note too. I have that note that you just made. The Orthodox theology is not the Talmud, and the real veneration of the fathers must reverence not the letter but the spirit. I mean, that could be straight a quotation from Vorowski, where he talks about the dangers of what he calls a theology of repetition, as opposed to acquiring the patristic mind. So we're dealing with a sort of a very subtle distinction here between what Vorowski was really advocating and the way it was interpreted subsequently in a more simplistic fashion, as simply going back to the fathers as having all of the wisdom for all ages and all problems.
Is it, do we see that, is it possibly because each had a different grand vision, or whatever, I don't know if manifesto is the right word, or what the grand vision of how Orthodoxy should go forward, and they diverged on certain issues?
Well, I think
and it just comes out like this, where we sometimes see contradictions, and sometimes we see like they're saying the same thing.
Yes. Vorowski clearly was sort of struggling against the two dominant modes of theology that he saw in his time. One is the Western-inspired academic theology following a scholastic model, a very philosophical approach to theology, and the other was also a philosophical approach, but not the same philosophy, of the religious Renaissance, using modern theologies rather than Aristotelianism in particular as a sort of basic philosophical framework. So he was struggling against both of those by emphasizing the fathers. But to the outsiders, it seemed like he was overstating his case. He was saying that we should use the fathers to resolve our modern problems. But as we saw, that's not what he was saying. That's the way he was interpreted. And this is what Bulgakov is criticizing here. But you're quite right to point out, some of the statements in here are in line with Florovsky's project. Whether, you know, where I think Bulgakov goes much further is raising those yellow flags, saying there's a danger here. Florovsky never goes that far in sort of pointing out to the risks the way Bulgakov does, and others. Sorry.
Yeah, and just one comment. I think that, like, to me, it seems to me that they actually forget the idea that God is, and that God actually, through His energies, communicates with holy man, even nowadays, like with whoever. So I think that this, just taking this Hellenic theology and Hellenic approach and psychology, I think it's we should say that. I think we should say that the holy men do exist even now, and God communicates through His energies even now. He is now here.
Mm-hmm.
So on a rational, and maybe not on a rational, but maybe on a analysis, the holy man can actually come up with the idea, taking into consideration contemporary issues, and the God, because the fathers actually communicated with God, and they received this Sophia, they received this wisdom right from God. I mean, it didn't come up like by themselves, right? I think.
Yes, but it's still, it has, as I said, the patristic writings do not have the same status in the Orthodox tradition as Scripture.
Of course, definitely.
And that's why I said they can be criticized, and they have to be seen in their own context. Bulgakov in this text refers to this tendency to canonize the writings of the fathers as opposed to the persons of the fathers as a patrological heresy. That's a bit, he's sort of overstating his case a little bit there, but he refers to that. Another one who uses almost the same expression is the Greek biblical scholar Petros Vassiliadis, whom we'll see when we look at Greek theology. This is on page 246, sort of skipping ahead, an essay that Vassiliadis wrote in the late 1980s, published in 1991, Greek Theology in the Making, Trends and Facts in the 80s, Vision for the 90s, Petros Vassiliadis. On page 246, at the top of the left-hand side, the Greek Orthodox theological renewal was no doubt signaled by George Florovsky's slogan, "Back to the Fathers." Well, it really wasn't Florovsky's slogan, but that's how it was interpreted. Having said this, I by no means underestimate all that has been achieved by the so-called Orthodox academic theology, and we'll come back to the interplay between academic theology and neo-patristic theology in Greece in the next class. However, this revival, despite Florovsky's own remarks not to return to the dead letters of the Father, has become a nationwide liberating force, has seldom become a nationwide liberating force leading to a holistic understanding of all aspects of theology in everyday church life. Very often, return to the Fathers was understood in a fundamentalistic way, similar to the biblical fundamentalism of the Protestant world. Some have regretted this kind of patristic fundamentalism that has replaced a biblical fundamentalism that flourished during the climax of the activities of the religious organizations in Greece. So we'll see the sort of context, the Greek context that he's referring to in the next class. But see, he refers to this kind of dogmatization or absolutization of the writings of the fathers as patristic fundamentalism in the similar way that Bulgakov refers to as a patrological heresy. Okay, in a similar vein, another critique of neo-patristic theology goes under the heading of consensus patrum. This is a kind of standard phrase. So, very interesting enough, using the Latin phrase, consensus patrum, literally consensus of the fathers. And the basic thinking here is that the fathers, because they were holy men, always thought in the same way, reflecting the truth. Now, this is the kind of a very gross oversimplification of what consensus patrum means. The critique here is basically that there is a tendency to treat the fathers precisely along those lines, as though they always thought and wrote in a similar fashion, in agreement on theological issues, which
they actually differ a lot. There's many differences.
Exactly. That's the point. It also, the critique also, this approach also ignores the fact that even Greek Byzantine theology evolved over a period of centuries. Just to take the Byzantine Empire lasted 11 centuries. So a lot of things can happen in 1,000 years. Different problems, different issues, not as quickly as they happen in modern times. But still, there's a tendency to sort of collapse the fathers into a kind of a single voice. Yes. And this is the basic critique of consensus patrum. Berdyaev mentions this in passing, page 186. B. He simply says, this is 186 B, sorry, on the right-hand side, the last phrase there. He simply says, the teachers of the church wrangled much amongst themselves. And then he goes on about Florovsky. And Florovsky himself finds in them heretical tendencies if perchance they are not in agreement with him. But the remark about the teachers of the church wrangled amongst themselves, which is true. They did not think the same way, even about similar issues. I have to qualify that with one exception, is that once the church had determined a precise dogmatic statement for a particular issue, then yes, the fathers of the church, they might have used somewhat different language, but basically were in agreement with the dogmatic determination, especially by ecumenical councils. I mean, this includes particularly concerning the Trinity, the Incarnation. Those are the sort of key Christian doctrines. But in other areas, you have wide divergences of opinion. One critique, this is a Ukrainian theologian called Boris Gudziak. Who is a Ukrainian Greek Catholic bishop in Christendom. He writes, the differences exist among the Greek, Latin, Syriac, and Coptic patristic traditions, but also within each of them. There are numerous explicit contradictions in the corpus of literature, constituting what Florovsky calls the normative legacy of sacred Hellenism. So even Florovsky had this tendency to sort of collapse the fathers into kind of an amorphous single voice, rather than a diversity of opinions and ways of trying to express the same truth in slightly different ways.
Is it correct to say that the church was accepted a certain, let's call it mystery, in
Yes.
the terms, and was able to deal with that? Meanwhile, what we're finding is that there's a tendency towards dogmatizing and taking that away, that flexibility that the church was able to work with throughout the centuries.
That's one of the risks of attempting to put everything down in precise terms to the sort of last letter. It's particularly evident in academic theology, but it's one of the dangers of a neo-patristic approach, which uses this kind of flat consideration of the fathers, is to what I refer to as evacuating the mystery. In other words, to sort of abolishing
Right.
the mystery, that whether you're talking about the Trinity or the Incarnation or salvation or the church or anything else, it's as though we can say everything that can be said. Well, we can't.
Yeah, exactly.
About these, and
That's what's unique about Orthodoxy, really.
That's
compared to.
And they said this is one of the critiques of neo-patristic theology as a methodology. For example, going again back to Bulgakov's essay, page 119-7. 119-7. Number 6. This is at the bottom of the left-hand side, the last paragraph. It becomes clear to anyone who happens upon patristic writing that even in the realm of one and the same question, there is rarely a single patristic tradition. These often contradictory, or at least different, opinions. You see, that distinction is important between a contradictory and a different opinion, because a different opinion can simply be a different way of trying to express, to say the same thing. Therefore, force us to make a choice, to give preference to one or another patristic tradition, as in fact done. This means that the Holy Father's writings in themselves cannot be considered dogmatically infallible. They are authoritative witnesses, but cannot by any means be transformed into unerring texts. In some circles, one finds a rabbinic approach to the writings of the Fathers as tradition. That is the key point of his, virtually the whole essay here. The writings of the Fathers cannot be considered dogmatically infallible. They are authoritative witnesses, but they cannot be transformed into unerring texts. In other words, saying they are not Scripture. And yet there is this kind of tendency when one reads certain writers in the neo-tradistic mode, they simply quote a writing from the Father, this or that, as though it resolves all the questions, which is really a Talmudic approach. For example,
it's actually Latin. Sorry, the Latin Church, don't they produce encyclicals and say, okay, this is how they're going to, and it's almost we're making it this. We're tending. Am I?
There is more of a tendency in the Roman Catholic Church to do this. For example, the Catechism, the Catechism which is a kind of a consolidated theological text, has a lot of these kind of categorical statements, which is not the Orthodox tradition, as we've sort of been arguing here and in the previous class on dogma and doctrine, etc. What is really Orthodox dogma? So this is the point that they're making here. So said Bulgakov, writing in 1937. More recently, again to quote Bishop Metropolitan Hilarion Alfayev. Alfayev writes, Many are accustomed to speaking of the Holy Fathers as a group of persons working together and writing approximately the same things. The Fathers of the Church, of course, lived in different eras. They related their writings to distinct cultural, historical, ecclesial, and theological contexts, and were not infrequently engaged in controversy with one another. Besides, some fathers expressed so-called private theological opinions, theologomena, not adopted by the fullness of the Church. In this light, one may reasonably ask, is it at all acceptable to speak of the teachings of the Holy Fathers as a unique and coherent theological system, or should the expression patristic theology be used only as a generic term? In that way, for example, we speak of Greek philosophy, in other words, covering a whole multitude of different modes of thought and different approaches. And when we speak of Greek philosophy, again, perhaps it's more evident for anybody who studied Greek philosophy, from the pre-Socratics to Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Neoplatonism, tremendous variety of philosophies, but yet as a category, a generic term, as he says, we refer to Greek philosophy, it covers the whole thing. So similarly, patristic theology is not just one thing, it's also a very broad range of different approaches. Okay, let's go on to another one, another critique, which came up earlier this evening. And I mentioned the difficulty that neo-patristic theology, as it was practiced, in engaging with the modern world or new issues. And as we saw earlier, this question has been on the table in Orthodoxy at least since the mid-19th century, when Alexander Bukharev first said, the Russian Orthodox Church has a problem because it even refuses to dialogue with modernity, let alone try to recognize how it fits into a schema of salvation. Now, Bukharev dealt with that in a very awkward fashion by by renouncing his monastic vows and by asking to be laicized. But he put his finger on a very important problem that a lot of the Orthodox Church, even today, fails to recognize as being a problem. Because of the emphasis on tradition, on the fathers, this has made it very difficult for neo-patristic theology to deal with modern issues. So the issues that it has tended to deal with, in many cases, have been traditional theological issues. Now, there's a qualification, and I'll come to that. Let's look at Berdyaev again, because again, already in 37, he put his finger on this. This is on page 184. We're sort of skipping back and forth here in the reading, as though it were a kind of an essay, but actually it is. This is sort of, all of this are reflected in my book, of course. 184. Hilda, I think we're back to you. It's at the top of the right-hand side. Sorry, left-hand side. Top of the left-hand side. About 6 lines down. A mere repetition of the thoughts.
Mere repetition of the thoughts of the Greeks and the Byzantine patristics would signify a misunderstanding of their theme, the negation of this theme. Man can have new experience, new searchings, and new horizons can open up before him. The experience of Byzantium had its limitations, its horizons were constricted, and there was yet many a theme it had not put before the Christian consciousness. That world had its mission, and it had spiritual achievements, but within it there was an element of decay. It came to an end, it died, no, not in its eternity, but in its own time.
Okay, we can stop there. The next sentence I find offensive.
Yeah, I know. I actually more Yeah, okay.
But that's Berdyaev. That's his. I said he gets carried away with his
Yeah.
emotions. So what he's saying again is that there were issues that we're facing now that were not issues then. When he overstates his case, but he points his finger on a real problem that others have pointed to. One of the areas, one of the sort of broad areas where neo-patristic theology has probably had the greatest difficulty in coming to grips with it is the area of social and political theology. If we look at Bulgakov, again, his essay, Dogma and Dogmatic Theology, on page 119-10, he too points to the question of how do we deal with modern issues. Now, you have to sort of keep in mind that Bulgakov, like Berdyaev and some of the others that I'm not dealing with specifically, their background before returning or coming to the church was Marxism. And what attracted them in Marxism was particularly the social concern, dealing with problems of poverty and social inequality and oppression in society. And even though they came to the church, they came and were deeply committed to Orthodoxy and in Christianity in a broader sense, they retained the social consciousness. And it comes out here and there, and sometimes more explicitly in the writings, particularly in Berdyaev, but also in Bulgakov. So on the right-hand side of 119-10, the sort of third paragraph down, our present time. Now, and he's writing in 1937, but we can read it as today, with its particular problems, has the potential to be a great period in theology, but theology must rise to be worthy of its calling. After a centuries-long silence, Christian thought has once again come to concern itself with the problems of life. And in the teaching of the Church, Christian thought and the problems of life coincide dogmatically. When this happens, it leads to the unfolding of dogmas about God-manhood. The God-manhood pertains to all the contemporary issues of history and eschatology, Christian culture, social Christianity, church and state, the unification of church traditions in one church. Now, he's raising a number, in a very broad sense, a number of broad areas in modern society that have to be dealt with in a Christian and specifically Orthodox fashion. Is it here? He has a kind of a checklist. I don't see that. I haven't marked that. No. Now, the whole question of the relationship between church and society is probably the weakest area in neo-patristic theology, precisely because the way these issues are posed in modern times are quite different from the way they were posed in patristic times. Yes, one will find in the writings of the church fathers, the early church fathers, particularly, for example, St. John Chrysostom, concern about questions of wealth and poverty, relations between church and state. But they were looking at problems in their times, not the issues that we're facing today with large-scale societies and social and political concerns. whether it's democracy or social programs, modern means of communication. These were not issues in patristic times. So I said this becomes a weak area in the neo-patristic school. One finds here and there in the neo-patristic writings a few essays, including one by Forovsky and one by an important one by Paul Evdokimov, but by and large it's not a major concern. If one compares I'll leave that aside. Again, I keep going back to Berdyaev's review because he anticipated a lot of these critiques in looking at Forovsky's book. On page 184, 184, A and B, 10. It's at the left-hand side. The paragraph at the bottom of the page there, Father George Forovsky in his book discovers the full atrophying for the social just truth. It's a very awkward translation to be a religious problem. It's really starting from the next sentence. Mikhail, do you have that? He does not understand.
He does not understand the theme of moral
indignation
against the wronging and opposing of man. He reckons it is possible to deprecate Vladimir Solovyov for seeking social just truth and for wanting the realization of Christian just truth in social life. This perhaps might be explained by that in his Byzantine orthodoxy, it was not authentically involved with man. When they look upon man exclusively as a sinful being to be saved, then it does not touch upon the absement of man and outrage against his dignity. Father Florovsky does not at all turn his attention to this, that Russian soul amongst the cultural stratum was rent by a terrible wrong of serfdom. The basement of man by autocracy, and that this imprinted itself upon the whole Russian thought. For him, this was exclusively a match of sentimentalism, of felt susceptibilities, and therefore the Russian thought of 19th century is foreign and unintelligible for him, with its searching for the just truth of madness.
Okay. Further down in the next paragraph, about a dozen lines down, Father George Forovsky evidently considered moral feelings and heightened consciousness as utopianism. He struggles not only against romanticism but also against utopianism. What Berdyaev is criticizing here, I said, is a sort of lack of consciousness, social consciousness. Forovsky is an intellectual, and his interest is ideas. So he kind of overlooks the social context, even of Russia in the late imperial period. The reference to serfdom, the debasement or oppression by the autocracy, that is the nobility, the upper classes, he doesn't see that as being a problem, whereas in the Russian religious Renaissance, particularly starting with Soloviev and Berdyaev himself, this was a major concern of them, that there was something wrong in terms of Christian principles for this kind of oppression of whole segments of society. And again, sort of comes back to the theme that Berdyaev is criticizing this in Florovsky's book, but it is a reflection of the difficulty that neo-patristic theology has had in dealing adequately with the sort of whole social, political, cultural scene. Others have picked this up. For example, another contemporary scholar, he's not Orthodox, but he's written a very important book on modern Russian theology called, his name is Paul Vanier. He's an American, an Episcopalian in the United States, equivalent to the Anglican Church, and he's written a book on modern Russian theology, focusing on three authors, Bukharev, Soloviev, and Bulgakov. He's also written an introduction to a volume called The Teachings of Modern Orthodox Christianity on Law, Politics, and Human Nature. This concerns half a dozen modern Orthodox thinkers and their teachings or writings on these areas. So the teachings of modern Orthodox Christianity on law, politics, and human nature. Actually, most of the authors dealt with in this book are from the Russian religious Renaissance, rather than the neo-patristic school, precisely because the Russian religious Renaissance was dealing with contemporary issues, particularly in the areas of the social and political structures of their times, even legal philosophy. Soloviev elaborated a Christian legal philosophy.
How is this possible in a state where we have a separation of state and church? In terms of having the social aspect, the impact on politics or social decisions.
Well, I mean, it's possible in the sense that what Christian principles should be applied in a secular state.
I agree, but how is that going to be accepted by the secular state? Because it'll probably look at it as an infringement on its.
Yes.
I'm just.
Well, I can only give an example. It comes under a theory called overlapping consensus.
Okay, that's interesting.
This is developed by an American philosopher. I think his name is spelled Rollins. But he's the one who came up with the expression of overlapping consensus. And it's particularly a theory in legal philosophy. What he meant by overlapping consensus is that it is possible in a pluralistic secular society for different interests in society coming from different perspectives. So, and one of these perspectives could be a religious one. It could be a non-Christian. Or it could be a purely secular one. Three quite different approaches to human existence and human society. Even if they come, his theory of overlapping consensus, even coming from different perspectives, it's possible to discern an area of consensus. Perhaps not the justification, because coming from, say, a Christian perspective, the justification for this can be quite different from a non-Christian and from a secular one. But it's possible to agree on this because, as I said, there is an overlap in the conclusion, not necessarily in the justification. The prime example of this, and there is an example, is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was proclaimed in 1948, as I recall, by the then United Nations, which of course was much smaller than it subsequently became. The way this was developed as a document considered by the General Assembly of the United Nations, there was a group of philosophers, theologians from different parts of the world, different religious and philosophical traditions, as a kind of a commission under the leadership of quite a well-known personality, Eleanor Roosevelt, the then widow of Franklin D. Roosevelt. She chaired the commission. So, as I recall, there was actually a Canadian on this commission. I don't remember the names now, but there was a Canadian jurist, a legal philosopher. There was a Chinese philosopher. There was a Jew. Who else? There was actually an Orthodox on this, a Lebanese jurist who was a member of the commission. I think there were 5 members. So they were coming from very different philosophical and religious backgrounds. And they developed a draft that we now know as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. If you look at that, you will see that there is no justification, there's no elaboration of the reasons why the principles that are stated in the Universal Declaration should be adopted. As I said, it's a prime example of this overlapping consensus. They agreed on what should be said, but they could not agree on the reason why it should be said.
So that nucleus, that consensus would form the nucleus for, I guess, decision making or policies.
Yes.
Within
yes.
society and the state.
So I mean, this is perhaps a little bit an indirect answer to your question of how it is possible. This is one explanation, and I think to me it makes a lot of sense of how it is possible and why it would not be necessary for a secular state to adopt all of the justification from a Christian perspective for a certain course of action. So, I mean, we could say, well, Christ has commanded us to love our neighbors. One aspect of our love our neighbors is that we care for those who are the weakest. And in the whole parable of the Last Judgment, did you feed the sick? Did you house shelter the homeless, visit the prisoner? All of that is a part of the Christian approach to social issues. So we would use that as a justification for social programs, for example, that do that. It's not necessary for the state to adopt that kind of language. But the conclusion is fully justifiable in Christian terms. Sorry, I sort of got a little bit, but it's sort of
questions. No, but I like it.
Okay, let's try to get back to this problem of neo-patristic theology in dealing with contemporary social issues. though I want to quote from Paul Valliere. That's where we started from. His name has already disappeared from there. In his introduction to this book, The Teachings of Modern Orthodox Christianity on Law, Politics, and Human Nature, in his introduction, Valliere highlights the weakness of neo-patristic theology to engage in areas related to social theology. Valliere is very much a defender for the Russian religious Renaissance. That's the main theme of his academic work. So, here's what he writes. An area of concern which neo-patristic theology did not share with the other movements in 20th century theology. Now, what he's referring to here by other movements in 20th century theology are actually non-Orthodox Christian movements. Is the one with which this volume was chiefly concerned, namely law, society, and politics, Neo-Thomism, with which most modern Roman Catholic thinkers were connected in one way or another, is inconceivable without its legal, social, and political agenda. Protestant neo-orthodoxy, however we understand its original motivation, inspired the ethical and political genius of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Its American counterpart produced Reinhold Niebuhr. Now you sort of have to be familiar with, to some extent, the history of modern Western intellectual thought. The Orthodox neo-patristic movement, by contrast, did not inspire much work on law, society, or politics. And I said, basically, I think he is correct, although there are a few, I would say, minor exceptions. This is being partly corrected, I would say, in more recent times, in the last 2 decades, where a number of Orthodox scholars have, in fact, focused more explicitly, particularly in developing Orthodox approach to political theory, or sort of an Orthodox political theology, if you want to call it that. But in most of the remainder of the 20th century, this is not an area of great concern. Okay, another area that I want to touch on briefly is weakness of biblical scholarship. Again, partly because of the focus on the fathers, biblical scholarship was relatively neglected. In part for a number of reasons. One of these is a historical reason associated with the emphasis during the Reformation and in Protestant theology in general on the Bible as the sole source of Christian tradition. So there was a kind of a reaction, if you like, in Orthodoxy, not to put too much emphasis on the Bible, not to disregard the Bible, but to disregard biblical scholarship, particularly as it developed in the 19th century. So those of you who are taking the biblical course will know a little bit what I'm referring to here, and then some of the Protestant approaches to treating the Bible as simply, if you like, a work of literature that can be analyzed and dissected in literary terms, rather than considering it as the inspired word of God and the basis of faith. So this made it difficult for Orthodox scholarship and theology to deal adequately with biblical thinking. It's not to say that there have not been Orthodox biblical scholars. There are a number of them in the last few decades, but it has not been very high on the Orthodox theological agenda, both because of the sola scriptura doctrine in Protestant theology, and the rise of biblical criticism, which appears to detract from the Bible as a source of faith. Those are sort of the fundamental reasons, but neo-patristic theology inherited this weakness from really an earlier period. The last major critique, which is very much an enduring one of neo-patristic theology, is that it has an inherent anti-Western bias built into it. And if we look at the major premise underlying Florovsky's Ways of Russian Theology, it's possible to sort of read this into his premise. His premise is that Western influences over the centuries, particularly since the fall of Constantinople in 1453, corrupted Russian thought and by extension Orthodox thought as a whole, producing a Western captivity, as it's sometimes referred to, or even, although Florovsky himself never actually used that expression, even a Babylonian captivity of Orthodox thought. Now, again, Berdyaev saw this in Florovsky's book and attacked it. This is on page 185, book 14. Page 185, on the left-hand side, the second sentence, he being Florovsky, holds to a completely mistaken, okay?
He holds a completely mistaken and antiquated opposition of Russian and the West.
Now, and when you can read in this, he's talking about Russia because he's referring to Florovsky's book, but if you read it as being between Orthodoxy and the West, then it makes more sense in a broader terms. So go ahead.
This opposition he borrows from the Russian thought of the 19th century, but with this original twist, and he regards in a negative light not only the West but also Russia, since that it has given in to the influence of the West. To the West he sets in opposition the Byzantine East. He reacts both critically and negatively towards Russian Christianity and Russian theologizing on the basis that he sees it in a Western influence. This is a fundamental concept within the book. Russian Orthodoxy was at first thoughtless. When thought awakened, it was then stifled by the stifled by the Western influence. Father George Florovsky considers Russianism a Western thing. Everything that is Western stands beneath the negative standard and is a deviance from the true path. All the woes of the Russian theology and Russian thought are consequences of the rift with Byzantium. But Byzantium went into decline and it died, and with this ended the true unfolding of thought, and thereafter there began deviations.
So, I said he put his finger on this. We're seeing it in the book. We have to try to sort of understand this because it is a major and permanent critique of neo-patristic theology. I think it's important to make some distinctions here. One is a distinction, probably the most important one, between a critique of certain ideas that grew up in Western theology in particular, which moved away from or deviated from Eastern or Orthodox theology. Now, I mean, the major one we can point to easily is, of course, the Filioque, which was a sore point between East and West already in around the 9th century and has remained so. A lot of the writings of modern Orthodox theologians is an attempt to define the specificity of Orthodoxy in relation to Western Christianity. And this involves critique and distancing from certain aspects of Western theology. I mean, the most obvious one is that, but there are many others as well. That's one thing. The extreme of that is a kind of total critique and rejection of everything Western. And one also finds this. The sort of line of thought is that because of the cumulative effects of the Renaissance, the early Renaissance, the age of the Enlightenment, the rise of rationalism, the rise of secularism, atheistic. I mean, atheistic thought. The West has become corrupted and is no longer a valid model or should be followed for Eastern Orthodoxy, which has retained the purity of the Christian faith. This kind of critique is even, I would say, a state ideology that we find reflected in contemporary Russia. And therefore, sort of all of the sort of Western ideas that grew out of this kind of philosophy have to be combated, including capitalism, socialism, democracy, equality, free, human rights. I mean, all of this is sort of tossed into the same bag. This is a kind of a systematic anti-Westernism, which goes well beyond critiquing particular ideas that we can find in Western Christianity. And we find both in modern Orthodox thought in the last half century or so. What is a little bit peculiar here is kind of distinguishing between those theologians who have sort of stuck to the notion of critiquing particular ideas, but without falling into a generalized anti-Westernism. For example, if we look at somebody as prominent as Vladimir Lossky, with whom you are now well familiar, if you've gone through his book, he criticizes a lot of Western theology in his book and contrasts it with Orthodox theology. And yet, Lossky is by and large not seen as being systematically anti-Western. There are a few who have been seen as systematically anti-Western, and they are primarily Greeks rather than the Russians. So people like Lossky, and even Florsky himself was very critical of certain aspects of Western Christianity. But as I said, are not seen as being fundamentally or systematically anti-Western. The ones who have sort of are branded, partly unfairly, I think, as being systematically anti-Western are in particular Father John Romanides, and Christos Yanaras. Because of sort of the way they approach in their theology the contrast between East and West, sort of one is up there and the other one is kind of down there. Yanaras, he certainly is the most prolific Orthodox thinker in modern times. He's written about 75 books that have been published. He's aware of this critique of that he's considered to be sort of broadly anti-Western. In the preface to the English edition of his book, he has a book called Orthodoxy in the West, where it's really, the title is very broad, but in effect he's talking about Greek Orthodoxy in the West. He's really talking about Greece. He felt the need to try to divert this criticism by saying that his target was not an external Western adversary, but rather the problems faced in Greece, as he describes it, a society radically and unhappily Westernized. Well, I don't know if there are any questions on this. Said this critique is a very important one, and because it does tend to be perpetuated and reflected in a lot of Orthodox writing at different levels, and particularly on the internet, one sees a sort of a gut reaction against the West.
I mean, how much of this is probably because of maybe certain political decisions that have been taken by the government that impacted maybe the life of those states and of what they term as the West, and that kind of translated into the theology of it? Like, how much politics plays a role in those?
Well, I mean, certain political decisions. I mean, I don't know what you're referring to in particular. You're referring to questions of abortion, recognition.
No, not necessarily only theological decisions. I'm talking politics in terms of, I don't know, let's look of what the States, for example, is doing in the world in terms of military conquests and things of that sort. I don't know how much of that piece seeps into the consciousness of people when they're criticizing the West.
Yes.
And it translates into the theology aspect of it. I just gave the States as an example.
I think it's, I guess I was trying to deal with it in sort of a broader philosophical sense. That I tried to express. You know, the West has gone off in a direction dominated since the 18th century in particular by rationalism, leading to, in many cases, if not outright atheism, a tendency to sort of push God to the margin and push religion to the margin of society. And hence you have contemporary Russia trying to assert itself by saying, no, that's not the way to go. You know, democracy is no good. It's sort of a flawed political system. We want an autocratic state based on the Byzantine model or on the Russian imperial model. And we will undermine your democracy in order to promote this kind of authoritarian values. The difficulty here is that we who are living in the West and are trying to follow a Christian life, and even those who advance this kind of criticism, nonetheless enjoy all of the benefits that the Western rationalism has developed. Modern science, I'm sorry to admit it, is based on rationalism. scientific principles are not based on theology. They are based on observation and deduction, which are rational, empirical considerations. So it's fine to criticize Westernism, but if you really want to criticize Westernism, give up your cell phone, don't fly airplanes, don't drive a car, forget about modern medicine. These are all products of Western society and a Western philosophical mindset.
Yes.
How can you enjoy all of the benefits and yet say, oh, Westernism is bad? Well, you're not being consistent.
Right.
Because you're enjoying the benefits without looking at the broader context in which those benefits were developed and are now worldwide.
I think we got lost somewhere in the middle, like a
Yes.
transition between, because I initially understood the criticism of the West mostly to be like the Western theology, more like.
But
like Latin
it
theology.
goes much broader than that.
Okay.
It's not only theology, it goes into the whole structure of Western society.
Right.
The whole, the basis of democracy, the basis of freedom of expression, almost everything that is reflected in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That is the sort of broader context. The basis for the critique may be theology, but the critique of the West, which many Orthodox advance, and you see it all over the blogosphere, goes into that sort of thing. So, instead of support for freedom, because freedom brings with it such things as legalization of abortion or gay marriage or whatever it is. No, we need to sort of go back to basic principles where these are not only sinful, they are also illegal. And the state must punish those who engage in these practices. I mean, that is a sort of basic mindset.
It's just an upside down control structure too. I mean, it's not what they're. I mean, instead of, sorry to interrupt you, but I mean, any society, I mean, in the course of history has its weaknesses and advantages. So instead of just looking at the good part and learning from it and maybe develop something new, I think they're just tossing the entire baby in the I don't know if that, I don't know. Sorry.
Yeah,
go ahead.
this is
just complicated. Yeah, let's just. I'm probably distracting from.
No, but we're kind of going beyond,
Yeah.
if you like, the context of the course
Yeah.
as such. But you can see the kind of ramifications of an initial critique that we find in Frosky, but also in another way, reflected in somebody like Lofsky, of certain aspects of Western thinking. But it's very easy to sort of go beyond that and sort of, as you say, throw out the baby with the bathwater and criticize everything in the West and yet live in the West and enjoy all of the benefits. Or even live in Russia and enjoy most of the benefits, because I'm sorry, but cell phones are also available in Russia. And they also have jet planes and cars and modern medicine and other gadgets that telecommunications gadgets, electronic gadgets that come from a rationalistic, science-based, science and technology-based society. Sorry, Becky.
Well, I was just thinking that like the Orthodox Christianity is very much like it's liberal. It's just the optional, right? Like if you want to believe in God, you can believe in God. This is the truth is in here. But for example, if you the modern issues are like gays and all this all actually have been there before, like Sodom and Gomorrah and all this, like the whatever is there. So it's just the free will, I think, is that if you want to believe in God, that's up to you. If you don't want to believe in God, but in terms of like putting this idea, like Byzantine was a state. The state religion was Orthodoxy, so it was a different mode.
Mm-hmm.
Now, like this mode actually does not exist. Like in Greece, it does. I think like the real Orthodoxy is, I think, it's a state religion as far as I think it's. Yeah.
I think to
It's
some
an
part of it-
established religion, not a state religion. It's not quite the same thing.
I think it's no.
No.
It's
A state religion means no other religion is allowed.
But like
An
official-
established religion means that the state actually subsidizes
Yeah, well,
the
like
religion,
the
which
main
it does.
religion,
Which it does in Greece.
Yeah, which is in Greece, but we are like in a secular state, so I think it's just
A
like
secular and pluralistic.
pluralistic state. Yeah,
state.
so like, and then the world is moving this way. So like, I don't think that like Orthodoxy is will be able to stop some sort of a movement. But what we have to find is that how we live, like how we are going to fit in this within this development. We are Orthodox, we are believers, and we believe in God.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think that modern technology, it's just the invention, like they just like invention of the mysteries of God, like even like this they're putting this, I don't know, all this stuff, but I don't think that this putting up some barriers, so we're not gonna go there, we're gonna go this. I don't think this will stop.
See, the social political model of this kind of thinking, as you hinted, really is Byzantium, or the Russian imperial state. Are we still there? I don't think so. And even in countries of Orthodox tradition, the inroads of a more secular, pluralistic approach to society and politics is becoming increasingly prevalent. Sorry to sort of wind up this discussion. There's one last point that I want to make. I was hoping you'd get on to Greece this evening, but I see we're not back to on that. One of the side effects of the emphasis on neo-patristic theology and approach to theology has been a very considerable expansion and interest in patristic studies as such. Now, this is actually the study of the fathers, and including also the translation of patristic writings into modern European languages. Orthodox don't have a monopoly on the fathers by any means. In fact, when we look at patristic studies as a discipline, Orthodox are a decided minority. There are many Catholic patristic scholars, there are many Protestant patristic scholars. One of the difficulties here is because of the emphasis, even within the Orthodox context, on the study of the fathers, is that it has to some extent detracted from consideration of other issues. Orthodox theologians and theology is a scarce commodity. There's not a lot of it around. So when we look at the discussion we just had on modern issues, fine, people, and there are many even contemporary Orthodox theologians and younger ones who have focused on the fathers. That's fine, but what about modern issues that we've just been discussing? There's a lot less attention paid, even today, to those kinds of issues. So there's nothing wrong with patristic studies as such, but it's the allocation of resources, if you like, or the individual decision making that says, I'm going to study John of Damascus or Gregory the theologian, his thinking on whatever it is. Okay, but what does, how about dealing with contemporary issues? It means that those resources are not available to consider modern problems. So that's been, I said, a kind of a side effect.
You know, sometimes the answer to that is that we stay true to the fathers and to scripture. So any contemporary issue is always, if it doesn't agree with what they think the fathers or scripture says, is totally denied or rejected.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not sure if this is how they define their involvement or engagement with modern issues, or is just a lack of actual engagement.
Yeah, in many cases it is a lack of actual engagement, because of focusing on either sort of studying the fathers as such, or studying traditional theological issues, which excludes questions of modern society, relations between theology and science. I mean, all kinds of issues are just sort of left by the wayside, and yet, you know, this is the world in which we live, and we have to deal with these issues. I mentioned last week, on the sort of plus side, there are a few specialized areas where the neo-patristic approach has been applied to modern questions. One of them is bioethics, the ethics of basically human reproduction and related issues. There has been a lot of good work on there, very much trying to apply what Forosky called the patristic mind to a modern issue. The other one is the environment. Again, there are a number of major Orthodox theologians who have looked at this and written about this using a patristic and scriptural base, but many other areas have not been tackled adequately. Just to sort of conclude now on neo-patristic theology, although it will come back, especially when we look at Greece, to some extent Romania as well, but also in our case studies. And this is a sort of complex relationship between religious philosophy and neo-patristic theology. Some people kind of see a separation between the two, an absolute separation, and sometimes they're referred to as schools. I systematically steer away from the notion of school, because that suggests a uniformity of thinking, which is not at all the case. I prefer to it as to think of a mode of doing theology, or an approach, or a way of theology. I mean, clearly there are very close relationships between, historically and in terms of personalities, between the Russian religious Renaissance and neo-patristic theology. I'd like to describe neo-patristic theology, or in Forosky's words, neo-patristic synthesis, as a child of the Russian religious Renaissance. A child, it's a rebellious child, but it has some of the characteristics of its parents. One of them is a reaction to the very stifling and restricted theological approach that dominated much of Orthodox thought from the 16th century to the to the mid-20th century in Greece, and the late 19th century in Russia, to the academic theology. Both stood against that kind of theology, so that they share it in common. Another characteristic that they share in common, although some would contest this, is a return to the fathers. Now, of course, one does not find this very much in the Russian religious Renaissance in somebody like Vladimir Soloviev. Soloviev was not very familiar with the fathers, but both Florensky and Bulgakov were. They were well versed in patristic thinking. Berdyaev was not. I think Bulgakov is the kind of pinnacle of Russian religious renaissance, and as I said, he did draw on patristic thinking in a lot of his writings. Another trait that neo-patristic theology inherited from its parent in the Russian religious renaissance is a high level of scholarship. The level of scholarship that one finds in Florensky and Bulgakov, even though we may disagree with some of their doctrines, they were well grounded in philosophy and history, in patristic studies, to sort of advance their points of view. And I think a lot of neo-patristic theology has inherited, as I said, this sort of high level of theology. Okay, any sort of final questions on this evening? Well, we will go on to Greece in our next class, and we'll see how some of these dynamics play out, with the introduction of a few other considerations that we do not find on the Russian side. On the other hand, as we'll see, and as I'll emphasize, there is no Greek equivalent to the Russian religious Renaissance. Well, we find academic theology and then the introduction of neo-patristic theology in Greece. So this will be, in effect, the major theme of our look at Greek theology, modern Greek theology in the last century and a half. Okay.
All right. Just have a question just about.
Fine.
Do you know we do like two presentations, like two general presentations?
Yes.
Do we have the dates, or not the presentation we are doing, like the essay presentation?
Yes, I'll have to have another look at that. I think did you make your selection of the second one?
No, has anyone made it?
Yeah, some have. Yes, I have to do a scorecard to see who has made their first presentations and who is still outstanding.
First we did all. I think second nobody did this.
No, nobody did, but some have selected.
I don't think I selected the second.
I also
did
have not. Did you select it?
I selected.
Your second, yes. Kareem, you did one of the later. I think it was a John Baer.
Oh, this one Baer.
Yeah. But please have a look at the remaining readings. In fact, let's look at for next week, next class on Friday.
Yeah.
So in the book of readings, what we'll be looking at is on the table of contents, page 3, the new theology in Greece. I don't know. Somebody want to tackle Romanides or Ziziolas?
Okay.
The other three, Yanaras's essay, Theology in Present-Day Greece, and Vasiliadis, and both of which quoted a little bit from today, are more secondary sources. But if somebody would like to...
Maybe like Ziziolas I can do, like John's theology, the local church. Is that?
Local church as a perspective of communion?
Yeah.
Is Romanides John on the ancestral sin? Is this the one that
Yes.
would reflect? Yeah, I'll do that.
Okay. All right. I think I prefer to perhaps
Send you an email?
Yes, if you could, to remind me, but
Yeah.
I'll just note it here already. Hilda on Romanides.
Maybe if I can do Callisto as well. I mean, I don't know. Sometimes later.
Orthodox Theology Today, Trends and Tasks. Yes, because somebody already has Kalizides and John Baer.
I can take Callistos.
Okay.
So a Callistos is going to be when?
I'll have to look. I'll have to drop a new timetable for the remaining classes before we start the essays.
So I'll do Callistos, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, I think some of the online folks will end up taking some of the ones that we've already covered, where no one has actually done a formal introduction to it. But I will look at that in the coming days and see, as I said, the gaps, who has and who hasn't done what, and draw up a more precise timetable. But the only one for next class will be the Romani days. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Good evening. See you
Thank you very much.
Friday evening.